We're here again for another Relearn Festival. This time it's looking at learning innovation, and we're delighted to be able to chat with Professor Dr. Yong Zhao again. Our topic for today is looking at where does education and schooling need to go beyond 2020, and what kind of lessons should we not lose from 2020. But that's where, as people might know, for both Yong and myself, we could stray into any direction going through. So welcome to the conversation today, Yong, and it's delightful to see you again.
Thanks, Stephen. Looking forward to this. I always enjoyed our conversations.
I'm going to do a little bit of an advertisement here. The photograph behind me is from the lovely Blue Mountains behind Sydney, going through. One of the things I've discovered during the remote lockdown periods and running remote online courses or schooling for different people is that the use of the Zoom backgrounds to generate conversations has been quite an interesting dialogue starter. And it's very easy for a 15-minute check-in with kids, teenagers and others to change into a 45-minute conversation as we all share our little personal histories and images as well. So Yong, you've got the universe behind you. What's behind you today?
It's University of Melbourne. It's because I have two jobs. I have different backgrounds. This is the University of Melbourne background. I work for the University of Melbourne and the University of Kansas.
Okay, so let's think about, our last conversation was in April this year. That seems like a decade ago. How have you travelled personally and emotionally? I'd love to hear that first of all, as we then use that as a backdrop for where we're going to journey educationally. So,
well, it's been almost really. It's I think 6 months, half a year now. I have not physically traveled anywhere actually, but I have traveled in terms of speeches, meetings, presentations, literally on all 6 continents. I have met a lot of I've met students, I've met teachers, school leaders, of course, researchers, and it's been good for me. I mean, I have really enjoyed not flying every day or every week somewhere. I've done a lot of writings, a lot of articles, a lot of, I just finished a book called Learners Without Borders. And I've been really trying to exploring the idea of how today individual students, if they so desire, they could actually learn, without necessarily going to a school. But they, of course, they need to maintain social relationships, interactions, but that can be done in other formats as well.
so okay, let's now think about 2020, just before we move on to 2021 and beyond. What have you observed? I mean, you've just said that you've met with people from across 6 continents. It has been an amazing year of opening up to the world, even when we've closed down on the world travel. It's been an interesting one. So what would be some of the key takeaways you've picked up during 2020 about what's going on in education world?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that innovations do not happen by themselves. If they happened, they can go away very quickly. I think if you look at countries that have returned to normalcy, somehow normalcy, let's say China is a good example. If when speaking to Chinese colleagues and Chinese schools, practically they're back to so-called normal. I don't think any of the changes that the students, schools, and teachers tried have stayed. And that's very sad to say that, online learning or remote learning has a lot of merit that should be staying, but it's not. So I don't think people should fantasize that after COVID, ended or somehow get controlled, when we return to school, whatever innovation happened, that will stay. I think that's the first big lesson. So do not expect education innovations to happen naturally, and they will stay. And then the second thing is that there are, however, a lot of innovations happening. We need to, as schools, be very careful, examining what we did right. And if we didn't do it right, what could be done better? I think there's remote learning has a lot of potential for project-based learning, for my kind of thinking about make learning more authentic, more inquiry-based, and to spread the learning time beyond schooling time. I think there's a lot of potential there, but that's not been examined carefully. That's not been preserved carefully. I think we can do some of that. The third thing is that the controlling, that is when we're locked down, we're not locked down. So that's another thing I think I've learned a lot, but we're not applying that to students. As adults, I bet almost all teachers have joined some part of this global connectedness somehow, some way. I think I bet almost all teachers have really expanded their thinking, and teachers and as well as school leaders and the school researchers. However, we're not necessarily applying the same experience to our students. If we can learn, if we are interacting globally, why can't our students? So I would like to see a lot more students kind of global collaboration, connection, and that would stay and maintain. Finally, I think schools, many schools haven't done this. They're still returning, to try to get this emergency out, but they could do a lot more, cross national, global school collaboration, student collaboration, reassign their teachers and teaching, rethink about what students should do, more group-based, more collaborative teaching, more project-based learning, more theme-driven. I don't think we have done a lot of that kind of examination, but the interest seems to be high. We kept talking, but we're not there yet.
Okay, so that's some very interesting observations, and I guess I would say that from my understanding of what's happening around me in Australia, that's a very similar story, probably New Zealand as well, especially as you've mentioned with countries like China, where basically many cities and towns have been able to return to a whatever they refer to it, COVID normal or whatever else the term we'd like to use. I'd love to hear from you though, amidst that sort of the waves of 2020, what are some of the little rays of light that you have seen from around the world? I'd love to hear some of those.
Well, I think first thing is that I do think there is a general movement towards social emotional learning. I think that's genuine. That's seen. A lot of people see the COVID does affect students negatively sometimes, and does affect our teachers. I think there's a genuine concern about social emotional aspect of that. And related to that, I think there is also, honestly, I was surprised. There's more people accepting the idea of students as change partners, as owners of their own learning. I've made a bunch of presentations in recently, really just highlighting the idea that students have to become the owners of their own learning, and they have to become a major partner in educational reforms. I don't think governments have taken that into consideration. I don't see any governments trying to highlighting the students as the change agents. We've been playing with the curriculum, we've been playing with pedagogy, we've been playing with assessment, but we have not invited our students to be the owners of their own learning. Students have to become, that's in terms of lifelong learning, whatever learning. I think in the more distributed learning model that COVID has forced schools to become, students can and should be given the true ownership. They should be the self-determined learners of their own. That's another highlight. I think that the third highlight is really, just fairly simple. Just this global connection is amazing. The teachers, they're enthusiastic. They are really trying to. I'm so happy to see so many teachers interested in making and leading changes.
Okay, again, you've raised some really, really interesting thoughts there, especially as I think back to our original conversation. I know that probably both of us would be on a very similar place when we're not worrying about any disruption that's happened. You know, we're not panicking about what's going to happen to the 7 or 8 year olds now who have had a very disrupted year of their learning. We have an optimistic perspective on human growth in that context. When you think about moving into 2021, beyond 2020, as we're all wanting to do, we're all hoping that things change faster than perhaps they're going to. What would you like to see? You know, if you could be the the world leader of education, what would you really love to see change in a child's day when it comes? You know, if just imagine we can get back to a free movement context.
Well, I mean, I think, this is a good time to think about schooling. Schools have been running really for this kind of schooling 100 years, and we've never stopped. And this is a good time, especially when for countries that have stopped schooling for more than 3, 6 months. Our students have been born to go to school. If you remember that in the modern days, that when you're age 4, you say, oh, 5, you say you got to go to school. Which school do you go to? So we've never had actually enough time with our children at home, and except for those homeschoolers. So the people who are driving education to say, I want my kids to be home more. I want my children to be like, but then we have this institution. You have to send your children there, starting age 5, graduating, you go. And but I think we need to really rethink about that. That is, maybe it says, if you are staying home as a parent, I know about over 40 to 50% of white collar jobs are actually doing from home. And so if you're staying home, and I know, children may be annoying, but actually they may be learning more. They may be learning something different. Maybe hanging out with you, rebuilding your own children's social life, not necessarily with students they may or may not know in schools, or they may or may not hang out. You may have a different relationship. So that, I understand, given the digital divide, given income equity, not every family has a chance to oversee their children. Not every child has the same access to libraries, museums, books, technology. So I'm aware of that. So I'm not talking about this equity issue. I'm just thinking about, can we invite our education leaders to say, maybe we should build a different school. Maybe the school should follow the child, not follow the curriculum. If you remember right now, the modern school started by following the curriculum. We want children to do literacy and numeracy. So when a child enters school, the school has everything ready for the child. The child comes in, you go to this teacher, you stay with this group, then I have a lesson plan for you each day and each week and each semester, and you are in this grade, then you move to this grade, this grade. We had everything planned. What if we change our school as a true living community? When people say, well, schools should be learning communities. If it's a learning community, you should be responding to the members of the community. The members of the community should be remaking this school. But now if you go to a regular school, there's not much students can change. So if I were running this whole show, I would say, first of all, imagine learning space as big as anywhere possible. You can learn that children can bring a lot of resources doing things. School should be more community driven, not grouping them necessarily in this traditional way. Students should be treated as the true owners of the school, and redo that. I would not do standardized testing. I would not do year level testing. I would not do any of the traditional instruction of one instructor to 25 students or 45 students. So I would really have a big change of learning as community driven, as individual inquiry, as not trying to impose upon everybody the same content, the same expectation, the same movement.
You've raised a number of really, really interesting topics there, and we could talk for hours.
Yep.
I think one of the things that you've sort of highlighted to me is that what what needs to happen behind everything else at the moment is the effective shifting of teacher mindsets about their actual role. You know, if they can move away from what they were trained to do, curriculum delivery or classroom management, into observing the individual child and actually then working out where does that child need to go, so that on the micro level we actually need to perhaps be thinking about really thinking through how do we get the teacher workforce able to be strong in this particular one area. And then you've also mentioned beforehand the need for, the growth in social emotional learning perspectives as well. And I guess again, how radical does our shift need to be for us to free up the teachers to become those people that can do what we're just talking about?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, Stephen, that I don't think anything is radical. Maybe you agree with me, but nothing is radical. I think, but for some people, this might be radical. But I think the really big change is very simple. Is to for every adults involved in education to look at the children, as human beings who have their own intention, their own interest, their own passion, their own strength and weaknesses. It is to help everybody grow up to be able to thrive in the world. It's and right now I think we overemphasize the curriculum, the content, the textbook, the assessment. If you look at schools now, most schools, school leaders and teachers, they were analyzing the data about children, their assessment. I was in Australia. I said schools have this data wall to have children. Say, okay, Johnny is at this level. He might be able to pass NAP plan next year. He may not. Let's focus on this. We were looking at things that really have very little meaning for young children or for older children. So that actually relates to another point I was going to make is if you look at today's children in developed countries, at least, I mean, this phone is amazing. Today's children, when they have a smartphone, they live a different life. Many parents and teachers have very little knowledge of what their children are doing, what life they're living. And when we argue about this content is important, this subject is important, our children have their own decisions. And there are children, of course, children can be seduced to do things. We have seduced some of children to be very good students. They do the homework, they pass the test, they listen to the teacher. There are some students like that, but not all. So let's think about a system that we look at children less at the curriculum.
Okay, so if a teacher needs to find what it is that will start to unleash their ability to change, what do you think is the one question that they really need to be asking of themselves so that the plug is pulled and all of the other things can start to flow through? Because I think for every, for all of us, there's often that little area where we've got to actually isolate or diagnose what's the actual issue that's preventing the change, preventing the innovation, so that things might flow quite differently. So if you had to choose what that one thing was, what would it be?
Well, that one thing I think is this general mindset among our teachers and school leaders that they have to deliver the curriculum and then they have to meet the test. So there's this assumption that we have to do it. Government has mandated curriculum, has mandated testing. We have to do that. In my conversation with many people, I actually would say very few, very few people would argue against what I was suggesting. Many of them, in the back of their mind, they are concerned about that. So, how do we help individuals to say the so called school system, the so called curriculum, the so called testing fails your children? Your children have a different life. When they grow up, when they graduate, they are not walking into a pre-made future. They are participating in making that future. But during this process, they are part of that future as well. They're co-constructing the globe with us. So because we had never really in education, other than so-called alternative education people, we've never, seriously questioned the value. Let's say, what's the value of Australian curriculum? You have a lot of people arguing, well, children should learn this, children should be able to do this, and but really with such a heavy document, what's the value for Johnny? What's the value for Mary specifically? Well, how is that going to help that person? And there's no evidence, no empirical evidence. The same thing with testing like PISA. Who is there to say what testing PISA is going to help you get a job or create a better future? Nobody. But we just accepted that. I think that's where we place this overly heavily on curriculum. But that's very powerful because parents buy into that. They say, well, if the government wants our children to do this, they must be able to do it. If they did it, they will do well. That's why now you have this argument in the media says children's learning loss due to COVID. So they said that if you look at the curriculum, they've lost this year to study the curriculum. I say, well, really? What about children learning to be independent? What about children learning to be more creative? What about children learning to be resilient? What about children learning to adapt? What about they're dealing with this COVID, this unbelievable thing? So are those not learning? Those will be great learning. But no, they're not, because government did not put them into this way. Remember, there are a lot of people who actually believe in the government in education. So once you have a curriculum, people say buy into that. They say, okay, well, I want my children by age 7, they should be year 3. If they're not year 3, I'm nervous. I worry about that. So we've created this gigantic fear among educators and the parents and the students, actually some students themselves, to say, oh my God, I'm being left behind. I'm at risk. This idea of achievement gap at risk is really driving people crazy. When you're like year 6, you are being put into remediation to do more math, to do more reading. Why do you need to do that? So that's I think human beings, we are very alive. We are natural born learners. We are very diverse. We have different situations, different context. We grow into our own people, but with good education, we'll become better people.
Okay, you've raised a whole range of really, really interesting topics there. I'm going to let you vision something now. I'm going to say, let's think about 5, 6, 7-year-olds, depending which country you're in, the age group that you start from. If you had to describe a day where or a cycle which would help children of those ages grow resilience, independence, and creativity. Just imagine you'd been able to do that in 2019 before 2020 hit. Let's look back to then look forward. What would that day look like for you if you had to describe what would be a really creative way, innovative way to think about what could the experience be for a 5, 6, or 7-year-old if we really deeply wanted to teach them resilience?
Well, let me actually tell you something, Stephen. I don't think I've ever said this. Uh, I remember when I was growing up in China, in a small village in the 1960s, 1970s. I can tell you, nobody was really teaching us. We were hanging out. I mean, we were doing work. We actually, like 6, 7-year-olds would do work, would get up in the morning to find grass for the water buffalo, find other wild vegetable for the pigs. So we're helping our parents, farming, all those kind of things. I can tell you, out of forced, almost all the children, I left and I went to school. Many of them have evolved resilience. Resilience comes from failure, comes from how we deal with failure. And I think right now we criticize ourselves. We say, okay, yeah, you're good, you're okay, didn't fail. I think that what we need, 6 7 year olds or 4 or 5 year olds need real activities, not just learning how to sit well. I think that's what our schools do too much. I think all learning, reading or math or whatever you want to learn, comes from solving problems, comes from students finding problems worth solving, then finding solutions to that. Teachers should challenge that, should always try to challenge students. Can you find a better solution? If you have children, when they grow up, whatever they do, you always try to challenge them. They enjoy the challenge. I think that's the thing. So they have to come up with solutions to solve the problem. They're playing, they're hanging out, but they're doing real things. Play, but play for purpose, and and learning, but learning for purpose. I think schools are the place you cultivate, you create ecosystems. There are a lot of opportunities for children to do different things. If they want to go read, they can read. If they want to interact with somebody, they can play with. So my teaching, my plan would be very authentic, organized around activities, but mainly around the problems children want to solve.
Okay, now our time is almost up, so I'm going to. Yeah, we've got probably a number of educators, teachers, parents watching this conversation. What would you hope that they do tomorrow?
Well, I would hope that they will forget the curriculum. They'll forget the testing. Really, I think follow your child. Children, human beings are born to be nice. Serious human beings are social animals. We are born to please other people. Human beings are born learners. They cannot not learn. We can't. Do you know how hard it is not to learn anything new? You cannot. So then what you do is not to say, okay, yeah, follow them, but you can guide them. You can create a learning environment. Ask children questions, but not asking the same questions. Well, what did you learn in school? No, no, no. What interests you? What drives you? What would you want to do? What problems do you want to solve? Cultivate that mindset. I would change that. I think that's something we need to do. So relearn. I like the conference name. Relearn. We need to relearn how we learned. We need to learn about the real life we lived. We need to know children are growing up as human beings, not as necessarily a recipient of a curriculum.
All right. So many rich thoughts in that conversation. So thank you so much. I'm feeling highly hopeful and optimistic, and I hope that those people who might share in this dialogue as well will leave in the same way. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your wisdom. And let's unite together to change this world.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephen.